All right, world history. We are now moving on to chapter 4. I had a chance to grade your chapter 3 tests. Most of you did very well. Again, just a reminder, I am grading that on a slight curve. So we are continuing the advance of civilization in the ancient world, now moving from Greece on to Rome. And we're going to go through these various sections. The beginning of the Roman civilization. This is basically the Roman Republic period. And then the Roman Empire, which is shortly before the time of Christ into the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Of course, the advent of Christ and the Christian church and how that ends up transforming the Roman Empire. And then its collapse, the barbarians at the gate in the 5th and 6th centuries. And then, as we did with Greece, a review of all that was achieved in the Roman culture. So the big ideas for the chapter, we see these on the first page here, the title page of this chapter. What were the strengths and weaknesses of the Roman Republic? Again, this is the several centuries, 5.5 centuries before Christ. What was the significance of the Pax Romana? Who can tell us what Pax Romana means? The Roman peace that happens under Augustus and continues for a few hundred years afterwards. How was Christ's coming the turning point of history? In other words, why do we use BC and AD? Why did the Roman Empire decline and collapse? And what impact has Roman culture had on modern society? So this will be the last section. All right, so section 1, we're going to cover on 2 different days. A lot to get through on this first day. So please pay attention and keep your book open, and I'll be asking you a few questions along the way. So again, section 1 is about the beginning of Roman civilization, and we're going to cover it in 2 different parts. What were the geographic features? This is what made Italy thrive and caused it to be different than Greece. Who were the early inhabitants? We're going to talk about Etruscans and the Latins, founding of Rome, early society and government, and we're going to see the rise of a republican form of government. And again, somewhat like Greece, this was fairly radical for the ancient world. Early Roman Republic, its establishment, the struggles within. In other words, there were these 2 major classes within the Republic, and there was a lot of bickering back and forth between them. And then the expansion of the Republic, and that's what we're going to cover tomorrow when we talk about the Punic Wars and guys like Hannibal, and how this city-state that took over a peninsula eventually ends up taking over the entire Mediterranean world, Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Egypt. Rome, the master of Italy. Again, this is all tomorrow in part B of section 1. Rome, the master of the Western Mediterranean. And again, this would be Hannibal and such like that. And Rome, the master of the Eastern Mediterranean. Here we're thinking about the conquest of Egypt, as well as Syria and Judea. Our guiding questions here. What were the important features of early Roman life? What were the strengths and weaknesses of the Roman Republic? And here we might think about, how is it like our republic? How is it unlike our republic? How did it pave the way for many modern republics? The ongoing legacy of Rome. Why did Rome become a dictatorship? In other words, what caused it to transform from a republic into a um, a empire when the Caesars take over? All right, so we start off as we have with most of these ancient empires talking about geography. Italy, as you may or may not know, is a very beautiful place. It's a very popular destination for European travel. Um, the geographic obstacles did not hamper the Romans as they did the Greeks. Does anybody remember what was distinctive about Greece that caused it to be not united or divided? Well, the mountains are much more imposing on the Balkan Peninsula than they are in Greece. Plus, the soil and the climate were more suitable for farming. Again, people love traveling to Italy. There's all kinds of wineries there, um, beautiful rolling hills, very, very popular place because it's so beautiful. Um, all sorts of little villages that you can visit as well as major cities. So anyway, instead of the way Greece pushed the Greeks to become sailors very early on, because their own land wasn't particularly fruitful, Italy was a place that was very fruitful. You can even think of that Latin word frumentum, from which we get the word fruit, which means grain. But then, because they were so successful and they thought they were the best, like many cultures do, they decided to conquer the entire region around the Mediterranean. And let's just remind ourselves what that word means: meta terra, middle of the world, or between the lands. If we think about, Europe on the north and Africa on the south, and the Near East in the east. So here's our little map, and we see these mountains, the Apennines or the Apennines. They are not as severe as the mountains in the Balkan region, um, or as the Alps are to the north. And we see the two rivers, the Po River, which is somewhat the northern boundary or close to the northern boundary of Italy, and then the Tiber River, which is very significant, of course, because that's where they build Rome, this set of villages that eventually becomes a major city, that becomes the capital eventually of a vast empire. But you can see that, not only did they have access to, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, but the boot goes down so far south that, it's not that far to sail to North Africa. You can see from Sicily to what would be Algeria, Libya, is not that far. All right, so now we're talking about the early inhabitants of this area. And before we get to the ones mentioned on the slideshow here, we have the Latins. And they don't know exactly where, but they settle near the Tiber River. And that, of course, is where Rome ends up being founded. Now, we've heard of these guys before. So these Latins were not covering the entire Italian peninsula, right? They're just covering this small region near the Tiber River. So these other peoples that were around in that area and who were great sailors, right? The Phoenicians, the Greeks, they were settling other parts of the peninsula, just as they had colonies, in northern Africa and places like that. Just as today, I was watching a video about South America and how there's part of France is actually in South America. French Guiana is actually part of France, just like Greenland. You may not know this, but Greenland is actually part of Denmark. So if you live in Greenland, way up there with the Indians and the frozen tundra, you're actually a Danish citizen. Anyway, so there were also these Etruscans, and they probably came in from the north, possibly from Asia Minor or somewhere else east of Italy. And they come in around 800 BC and establish one of Italy's early civilizations. And they take over the Latins for a while, and it's possible that they're the ones who introduce Greek culture. And this is a very important sentence here. Much of later Roman culture would reflect Greek tradition and customs. As we said, the Greeks are more quote unquote civilized than many of these other ancient cultures in Egypt, in ancient Near East, Assyria, Persia, etc. And the Romans recognize this and are able to sort of piggyback on it or appropriate it, swallow it up, as it were. We have this phrase, plunder the Egyptians, from the Exodus account, how the Israelites were able to take so much treasure from the Egyptians as they left. And in a sense, you could say that the Romans plundered the Greeks in terms of their cultural advances. Not that Rome is exactly like Greece, but they sort of saw themselves as a new Greece, even though they were a much more militaristic culture. So sort of like, what if you put Sparta and Athens together in Greece, and that's sort of what you get in Rome. All right. Well, what about the founding of Rome itself? This great city that ends up ruling the world. Well, again, it's on the banks of the Tiber River, inland a little bit from the seacoast, from the western side of Italy. And it ends up being these villages that during the 8th century, remember that's the 700s BC, Rome is known as the city on the seven hills. And it starts with these seven villages that form together on the seven hills. And from there, it just grows and grows and becomes this vast city. So you have these two brothers, supposedly, who founded the city. I want you to pause the audio right here and look at some of the things that the book says that Romulus did. What did he do to his brother? What did he do with the small Roman civilization that was beginning to grow then? All right, and famously, they were supposedly raised by a wolf. And so this is kind of a famous sculpture portraying Romulus and Remus suckling at their mother's breasts. All right. So early society and government. And much as we've seen with think of some of the other societies where family was important. Well, you can think in chapter 2 about China, right? And the family is always the basic unit of society. I mean, that's just the way God has made us. Granted, it may get corrupted through human sin, and we're obviously seeing a great corruption of it today with the whole redefinition of what a family is. But anyway, in Rome, the family was very important, and you had the head of the family, the paterfamilias, right? You guys know what this word pater means father. So the head of the family, the father of the family, and he has strong authority, again, which that's somewhat grounded in creation. and redemption according to Ephesians 5. It'll be corrupted by human sin apart from Christ. But anyway, so they take great pride in their family heritage, and those who are well off, use the family as a means of education. So um, there's also, as we've seen before, these two classes, right? We've been talking about how in many of these cultures in the ancient world, there are the haves and the have-nots. There are the aristocratic nobility, and there are the peasantry. And this is replicated here in Rome as well. And part of that distinction is who owns land and who does not. So the wealthy landholders, and that really is the key to being part of this nobility through much of history, is whether you were a landholder, because basically everybody who lived on your land kind of belonged to you, not just your immediate family, not just your children, but everybody there is bound to you. And we'll see this later when we talk about the feudal system in the Middle Ages. Anyway, the wealthy landholders were called the patricians. And again, you can sort of see the word patria, fatherland, in there, which comes from pater, father. And the plebeians were the have-nots. They were the ones who didn't own the land. And so they were dependent upon the patricians. They were beholden to the patricians. But there's going to be this sort of class struggle during this time of the Republic. So the early government of Rome was a monarchy, but that changes. Even though that's the way most of these ancient civilizations are ruled, we saw how there was a slightly different development in Greece, where in Athens you had this democracy that develops. This is what's in a different way is going to happen in Rome, but also similar. So the king had a bundle of rods enclosed over an axe called the fasces, and that symbolized his power. So here we see a picture of that, and kings often have a symbol, some kind of weapon or other instrument that represents their power. In the Old Testament, the horn is somewhat a representative of a king. There's also references to a scepter. If you go back and you watch a video of the crowning of Queen Elizabeth in 1952, you'll see that not only is there a crown placed upon her head, a symbol on her head to represent her authority, but also she's given this scepter, like a rod or a staff that she carries. So kings often had these symbols. All right, the establishment of what happens in Roman society and government. So 509 PC, the Roman nobility, they throw off an Etruscan ruler and they establish a republic. So this is from the Latin res publica, the matter of the people. And it's just a way of talking about a government, but it is different. It is a different government from either the monarchy that they had previously, and even from an oligarchy. It's going to be, well, somewhat like what eventually develops in modern democracies and what we have in our government, which is a representative republic. So there are, if you look at your book, you can see that there's three branches or three parts to this republic. Okay, there's an executive, branch and there's 2 legislative bodies. So it's not exactly like the 3 branches that we think of today in our government, where you've got legislative, um, executive, and judicial. All right, legislative would be the Congress, executive on the federal level would be the president, or on the state level would be a governor, and then the judicial branch would be the judges. So first you had these 2 elected consuls who replaced the previous monarchy, and they are sort of the executive branch. They are the ones who kind of make it happen and enforce the rules. And of course, what's interesting here is that they only are able to rule for a year at a time. So it's much like somewhat like our modern system of having a president who only lasts for how long? Well, 4-year term, he can be reelected to a second 4-year term. There was never any limit on that until after FDR passed away and they passed an amendment to limit it to 2. Now, until 366 BC, only from the which class did the consuls come from? Can you look in your book and see? They only came from the patrician class. So these landowners, these wealthy people who had more influence and more wealth. The Senate became the most important and most powerful body of the Republic during this Republican era, when the emperors come in later on, the Caesars come in, then the Senate, even though it still exists, has a lot less power. Think of Star Wars, episode 2 and 3, and how there's the rise of an emperor who displaces the Senate. Anyway, if you look in your book, you can see 3 things that the Senate did that showed why they had so much power. So we can pause the audio here and you can look up what were those 3 things. Now, besides the Senate, there was another legislative body, deliberative body. Deliberative is a fancy word that means they talked and then they made things happen. The chief assembly was the assembly of centuries. And so you could think of a century, and again, we're not talking about a centurion who rules over 100 soldiers, but if we think about, a representative who every 100 people, there's going to be a representative of them. So this would be a larger body. The Senate, of course, has more power precisely because they're a smaller body. They're more like an oligarchy. But you also have this other body. So this assembly voted on, can you see what it says here? So they voted on legislation submitted by the consuls. Okay, the consuls couldn't just enact a law by themselves. They made declarations of war. So you couldn't just go to war because you got mad at the country next to you. This is kind of like what we have in our Constitution as well, where the legislature has to make a formal declaration of war. And they elected high-ranking government officials. So think of how the Senate, so one of the things think of how the Senate right now is deliberating upon whether to make Judge Barrett a Supreme Court justice. That's somewhat similar to what this Assembly of Centuries did. One of the things that the Senate did was they were involved in foreign policy. And again, that's echoed in our government today, where the Senate, our U.S. Senate, has to approve foreign treaties. So if President Trump or whoever the president is wants to enter into a formal treaty of trade or whatever with a foreign power, he can't just do that by executive fiat. He has to have the Senate approve that treaty. So again, some of these traditions were very influential on the way the founding fathers put together our Constitution and our government. Um, all right, so as with many of these ancient empires, there were struggle, right? And so even though these different institutions, this um, these consuls, the Senate, the assembly of centuries, were supposed to represent all the people. The patricians really were the ones who they had the influence, they had the money, they had the power, and so they took control early on. The plebeians didn't necessarily like this, so they were pushing for their opportunity to be more involved, to have a say. And again, we see this as kind of a background to how we, you know, threw off British aristocracy, British monarchy, so that people could have a say in their government. So for 2 centuries following the founding, again, when was the founding of the Republic? It was in 503 BC, the end of the 6th century BC. The plebeians struggled to gain political and social, what does your book say? Equality. So the plebeians were wanting a seat at the table. They were wanting to be represented in these institutions and have a say in how they were going to be governed. So one of the first concessions gained by the plebeians was the right to have their own assembly and elected officials. Okay, so they were, in a sense, they were able to have a say in their government. Now, at first, none of the things that they passed had any sway over the patricians, had any influence over the patricians, but that's going to change as we move along. So the Council of Plebeians elected 10 men to the office of tribune, and they had a special role in speaking to these other bodies. So the tribunes protected the rights and interests of the common people. And can you see in your book what it says that they had the right to do? Well, when a law came down the pike from the other bodies, from the patricians, they had the right to say veto, I object, or I resist. And that's something that we still have today, where if Congress passes a law that the president doesn't think is right, he's allowed to say, I veto it. Now, the Congress, being the voice of the people, still has a right to override that veto, but it takes what's called a supermajority. So they have to get, I think it's 2/3 of the Senate, 67 senators at this point, or they have to get, and they have to get, I think it's 3/5 of the House of Representatives. And the same thing happens here in the state of New Hampshire. If the legislature in New Hampshire passes a law and Governor Sununu doesn't think it's the right law, he can issue a veto, and then it has to go back to the legislature, and they have to have these super majorities to be able to override it. So anyway, this is part of what the tribunes did. Now, eventually, continued pressure from the plebeians finally forced the patricians to put Roman laws into what? Into writing, scribere, okay, from which we get the word scribble. Put it into writing, and that's important. We talked about how tradition, even though it's part of how we do history, we can't rely upon it as much as written records because they can be changed over time. Think about when you play that game, what is it, telephone or telegraph, where you have a bunch of people sitting in a row and one person starts a story and tells it to the person immediately to their right. And then they have to try to tell it to the person to their right. And it gets down eventually to the end, and you ask the guy at the end, well, what was the original thing that the first guy said? And, it may have changed a lot. And so having a written, and you can see how a judge, could say, well, the law says this. And because it's not written down, the defendant has no way of really arguing against that. So this was a very significant advance in terms of people having a way to defend themselves. And again, one of these themes that we're talking about here through these civilizations, and you can see a small sidebar here in your book, is the notion of justice. How do we establish justice? And so having a written law code is one way that you can accomplish that. Because again, part of the advantage hereof is that if you have the law written down, you can actually go and study it for yourself. You can learn it yourself. You don't have to always have some, law person explaining it to you. You can go and learn it for yourself. So that, again, that's another advantage of having your. So eventually, around 450 BC, these laws are written down. So again, we're talking about, 60 years after, well, 53 years after the founding of the Republic, a generation and a half, and they were hung in the Roman Forum. You can see a picture of the Roman Forum there, the section of the city that was the center of government. So in other words, everybody had access to it. It would be like the fact that in Israel, the king was supposed to read the law every year. That was so that, in a sense, the people could kind of hold him accountable to it. Deuteronomy 17, I believe, is where that's discussed. So anyway, these tablets of law, called the Law of 12 Tables, became the foundation of Roman civil law. And again, kind of becomes the foundation of Western society, where you write things down so that you don't have to argue about it. Now, granted, you may have arguments about what exactly it says and how to rightly interpret it, but at least you have a common code. Thou shalt not murder, or whatever it is. Thou shalt not steal. Um, Now, eventually, later on in 287 BC, the plebeian assembly, now called the tribal assembly, again, think of these tribunes, the tribal assembly gained the power to pass laws binding upon, what does it say? All the people of Rome. So now the plebeians have gained enough power that they are actually, the laws that they pass are going to hold the patricians accountable, as well as the plebeians. Okay, so there's a leveling out that's happening. Again, it's not exactly the kind of leveling out that happens in our society, where we try to say that everyone has equal justice under the law, but it certainly was an advance, and it lays the groundwork for things that we hold important in modern society. So here is a picture of the Roman Forum. This is where they hung the law, and you can see what a remarkable, the Romans were known as great engineers, right? They're building all these roads, they're building these aqueducts, these ways to transport water from one place to another, and they're building these magnificent buildings, some of which are temples, some of which are halls of power. Um, All right, so what I'd like you to do is pause right now, take out a piece of paper, and write down the answers to these questions that cover part A of section 1. All right, according to tradition, what year was the city of Rome founded? By these two brothers, 753 BC. What were the two main social classes of ancient Rome? They both start with P, right? The patricians and the plebeians. What year was the Roman Republic founded? So again, this is quite a bit after, and that was in the year, end of the 6th century, 509 BC. 509 BC. What was the most powerful body within the governmental structure of the Republic? Again, a lot of you will know this from your Latin book. You learned it in chapter 4 when we talked about fourth declension nouns. Senate, senatus. What was the name of the Roman law that was written down and placed in the Roman Forum? The Law of 12 Tables. So again, that allowed people to read it and to learn it for themselves. What was the name of the plebeian assembly that gained the power to pass laws binding on all the people of Rome, regardless of their social class? The tribal assembly. Okay. How did the family unit play a significant role in the development of early Rome? This is pretty important, so you want to go back and look at the bottom of the page where this occurs. The basic unit, they taught their children loyalty, submission to authority, self-control, and duty. The Romans, some of you know this word virtutis. They had these virtues. Again, they're not exactly like Christian virtues, like faith, hope, and love. They're different than that, but they did allow them to have a cohesive way to think about themselves. Now, again, one of the things about these laws, by the way, is that these laws didn't necessarily apply to people outside of Roman citizenry, okay? Just because you were part of the Roman Empire or whatever didn't mean that you were a Roman citizen and that these laws, that you could appeal to these laws for justice, okay? Just as an example, you may be familiar with the fact that the Apostle Paul was born a Roman citizen, when he was Saul of Tarsus in the middle of Asia Minor, and he used that citizenship to make an appeal to Caesar, right? So that they would send him to Rome. And that, by the way, is when he was killed by Caesar. He was not crucified, he was beheaded, because crucifixion was only for a non-Roman citizen. That's why they crucified Jesus and Peter, because they weren't Roman citizens, but they beheaded Paul. So anyway, the family unit is very important for developing and transmitting these particular Roman virtues. All right, why did the political changes increase power of some plebeians not end the struggle for power in Rome? And this is at the very end of the section, and this is what's going to lead us into, in section 2, the advent of the empire, the fact that the Caesars come in, and it's because you still have class struggle going on, right? That's what happens when man is sinful. And in this case, the distinction between the rich and poor replaced the distinction between the patricians and the plebeians, and this led to an ongoing struggle for power. So again, it's only in Christ that people really learn to live together and really develop a sense of true justice and righteousness. So anyway, even though this class struggle started to be resolved, it got replaced by another class struggle. All right, so keep these answers in your book, and we'll see you the next day for the next part of section 1 as we talk about the expansion of the Roman Republic.